Richard Bynum, welcome to Partnering Leadership. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you in this conversation with me.
Well, Mahan, thanks so much for the invitation. I'm too thrilled. One of my favorite topics is leading, and so I couldn't think of a better person to sit down and chat with.
Well, one of the things I love about you, Richard, is that that might be a favorite topic of yours to talk about, but you have also shown it through your actions. Because an important thing in leadership is to align actions with what we say. And I have seen you over the years do that with your own leadership, which is why I would love to find out a little bit more about you. First things first, would love to find out whereabouts you grew up and how your upbringing impacted the kind of leader and person you've become.
It's a great question because for me, I grew up in a number of places. So I was born in Detroit, Michigan, and lived there with my immediate family and my mother's family for the first 10 years of my life. Detroit is a great town, always be my hometown. It's a tough place to bring up a young black boy, and certainly was true in the late 70s, early 80s. My parents had an opportunity with my dad's business, which was insurance, to head out to California. So we took off cross country and ended up in Northern California, just outside of San Francisco, where I spent a number of early adolescent teen years. And then there was a bit of a downturn in the market that affected the family. We went then to my father's side of the family, which lived in Central Florida, St. Petersburg, Florida, to be accurate. And I finished out high school there with them. Ended up staying in state and going to Florida State University for undergrad. But so I lived in a number of places and really distinct places, major metro, urban, Detroit at that time, still a motor city, California, a microcosm of the world, very diverse, very much in some ways reminds me of Greater Washington, where I live now. And then Florida, and anyone who's lived in Florida knows it's really three or four states, depending on how you count it. I sort of lived in the middle, which is very different than Northern Florida, very different than Southern Florida, has its own distinct culture. And I think I like to think I learned a lot from each of those different experiences.
So you had a chance to experience different communities. In addition to that, those moves must have impacted you and your worldview. How did the fact that you had to pick up every few years, three times until you went to college and move, how did that impact you?
I think it gave me a sense of perspective. It's funny because I can remember early in my career, as a young man, I was talking to a mentor and I said, I moved around a lot when I was a kid, bunch of different and good reasons at the time, but I did. And so didn't really develop what I would call deep roots. And I always looked at contemporaries who would say, oh, I grew up with this person. I went to kindergarten with this person and we're still my best friend. And I looked at that with a little bit of envy. And I was sharing with my colleague, I said, whenever I have kids, I'm gonna make sure that we sort of stay put. I want them to have what I thought I missed. And my colleague at the time rightly pointed out, it doesn't seem to have hurt you. And it took me a minute to really understand that. And I think what he was getting at was, you know, we oftentimes have difficulty looking at the world through others' eyes. And it's because we have one context, whatever that context sort of is, in many cases, is where we grew up, who we grew up around, the things that we did, what was normal, if you will, culturally and otherwise in our surroundings. And one of the things that I benefited from in moving around a bit was I got to see a number of different, very normal perspectives, and got to experience those, got to some degree internalize those. But even if I didn't internalize them, I got to understand how someone could arrive at a certain place, whether it was, in the deep South or in an urban market or in a very diverse and beyond, strictly black white diversity, a very diverse market. And so I still believe I take a lot of that with me in my daily life.
That's wonderful. Actually becoming better and more resilient, more anti-fragile as a result of all those moves, lessons that you still to this day use as a leader. Now, Florida State made sense because you were in Florida. Why political science?
So I wanted to go into politics, which is funny to me now because politics is the least important thing in my life, or certainly the least important. I'd like for it to be the least important thing in my life. I wanted to go into politics. I loved as a kid history. I love the context that it provided for where we are today. I think we lose a lot of that today. I don't think we as a country are great students of history. And if you're a great student of history, you don't have to be, a particularly deep thinker to reflect on things that have already happened and how we got to a place, to understand its impact on where we are at the moment. But that aside, I was a great student of history, loved political theater of history, and thought politics was the way forward. I actually worked on a couple of campaigns in my later time. And one of the things that I quickly abused myself of was the notion that politics was for me. I I had an opportunity to work on those campaigns and probably find my way to DC early in my career, and there were just a few things that just didn't really keep with other aspects of my upbringing, whatever my own personal stomach and gut on things issues, and so decided to go a different direction, and ended up graduating in a recession, pretty bad one, early '90s, before all of the internet sprung upon us, and found myself the beneficiary of some family help to get a job at the Red Cross.
And you had a lot of success at Red Cross, eventually going on to become a managing director. You were also an executive with Red Cross when September 11th happened.
Mhm. I was. Yeah. So for folks not familiar, and it's a little different today, I've been involved with the Red Cross back and forth as a volunteer since that time. The Red Cross is organized in a way that it provides local staff and volunteers the training and the experience necessary to then find themselves on larger national, man made, or otherwise disasters. And I had actually participated in about 25 national disasters before September 11th at varying degrees of responsibility. Um, September 2001, I am on my way to my office, which was in downtown Chicago at the time, as I was the director for response and relief. And my boss called and said, "Hey, did you see that plane hit the tower in New York?" And I, was in my car, and this was days before we had every piece of information and video on our phones. And so I said, "Yeah, I'm sure probably an accident or something. I'm on my way in. I should be in shortly." And within, it felt like a minute or two, another phone call, "No, no, no, this was a big plane, and a second one's now hit. I need you in here." And so came into our operations center, which was, for folks familiar with Chicago, literally on Michigan and Wacker in the heart of the Miracle Mile. And four flights, importantly, downstairs from the Israeli consulate in Chicago at the time. And it didn't take very long for us to figure out that we needed to get out of the building. For folks who weren't around at that time, you really didn't know what was happening next. And at this point, we were talking about New York and DC. Chicago didn't seem that far distant from what might happen next. We had a secondary location just outside of the city center. So I beat feet down to my car, a couple of folks in tow, and we made our way to our secondary location, and found there a circumstance where, while everything that was going on in New York and in Pennsylvania and DC was playing out, The other thing that was happening was that literally tens of thousands of people were being brought down out of the sky, out of the planes that fly overhead every day, landing wherever they happen to be close to, in many cases, quite a distance from where their destination was. And in Chicago, literally, we're talking, something on the order of 75, 100,000 people displaced. And part of our responsibility at the time as a member of the federal response plan and local emergency management activities was to go and provide support, including mental health support to all of those individuals. It turns out, which I suppose was a surprise to me then, and really kind of a surprise to me now, that when people fly, a lot of people, more than you might imagine, don't do so with like a lot of resources. Many people had no other real choice than to camp out at the airports. There's two in Chicago, O'Hare and Midway. And so literally we had some 50, 60,000 people sort of sprawled everywhere. And we provided support for more than a week to those folks while the events in New York and Pennsylvania and DC played themselves out. And then later on, I went and spent a little over a month and a half as the assistant director of relief in New York. Actually, in Brooklyn was where our headquarters was for September 11th.
Now, you ended up continually moving up through the ranks at PNC, serving different roles in 2010, 2014, coming to the greater Washington, D.C. region to lead the retail market here. Along the way, one of the things that is important for leaders is to grant trust and be trusting of people around them. It is also important on the other side to sometimes verify. You had an experience, a painful experience in terms of trust.
I did. I did. This actually happened before I became a banker. It's funny today, but so I mentioned that at the Red Cross, I had this $5 million budget, and people might say, why do you need a $5 million budget at the Red Cross? Well, what you need to know is that in Chicago, although we talk about floods and hurricanes and all of these very devastating things, every year at that time in Chicago, there were at least 2,000 home fires every year. That equates to something like 3 to 5 a night. So every night we would send out people into the city of Chicago to show up at a horrible, devastating home fire. By the way, that fire is as devastating to that one family or 3 families as every bit as devastating as a hurricane is to the people that it affects, right? So we have to show up and begin the process of trying to get them to think about where are you going to stay for the next 2, 3, 4 nights. What's your family going to wear? Because in many cases they've lost everything. And how are we going to get your family fed until you can get stabilized, and then we can have a plan of action for what the rest of life looks like as you rebuild. And so the Red Cross pays for that. The Red Cross provides those funds. And in doing so at the time, we did it through vouchers, really a voucher program, pieces of paper, literally. But we'd had relationships with grocery stores and hotels all over the city where you'd use these vouchers and you'd go and say, I'm here with the Red Cross. They would honor the voucher, and so this probably sounds like, cavemen to people these days, right? But you had this piece of paper, you showed up, Red Cross said, I can stay here tonight. Here's my voucher. They turn it into us. We cut them a check. That's the general gist of the process. And I had a person who was responsible for making sure that each of those vouchers came back in, that we reconciled, that they received the goods and services that we had authorized, and that then we would write a check for those vouchers. And now this was before business school. I was a political science major and before banking, right? So I had a lot of faith in that individual. because they were running that process for me. And then one day, probably about a year and a half or so since I'd come to that job, they went on vacation. You're going to go off. I'm like, that's great. Have a good time. Enjoy your vacation. And so then the process, though, continues because we're dealing with fires every single night. And so I had another coworker. I said, hey, come on over. You're going to sit down here. I got them all trained up. I need you to do this process. And she came to me, not even 3 or 4 hours, and she said, hey, there's something kind of funny with, I found a number of these blank vouchers in the drawer, and I found a couple of letters from people who haven't gotten paid. And it just seems like this is more than just, something that's going through the process. Can you take a look? And I said, well, sure. I'm sure it's fine. Right. So long story short, I found out it wasn't fine. Long story short, I found out that the person that I trusted actually was defrauding the organization, and we did what we were supposed to. And by the way, if you've ever been involved in one of those things, there's auditors that come in, there's forensic accountants that come in. We sort of trace the pattern. You've got to, and then you really, you want to find out, well, wait a minute, how far does this go? And I'm a young manager at the time, and I want to make sure everyone understands it didn't come to me. I had nothing to do with it other than being naive enough to think that this segregation of duties should have been more appropriately followed. Anyway, long story, after a number of months of investigation and so forth, we isolated approximately what the loss was. It wasn't off the charts, but it hurt. It was painful to me. But it was a great early lesson, which is I have a number of people who work for me today. I've had for a number of years. And if they work for me for very long, I trusted all of them. But I also verified. And I have processes that I still think about today. And I look for certain signs and key indicators. And when you start digging, you'll find what you need to make sure that we're on the right course. And that's just it's just an important, lesson I learned early, but painfully. And one that I think I'm glad to share with your listeners.
Yeah, so how do you strike a balance with that, Richard? One of the things that I talk about is the difference between granted trust and earned trust. And a lot of times leaders say people have to earn my trust,
Mhm.
but a lot of our organizations operate more effectively, most especially now in a virtual environment, when there is a higher level of granted trust.
Mhm.
So, how do you, as a leader, manage to strike a balance where there is granting of trust and there is the verification so systems are not abused?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think the first thing is, it's sort of it depends on how you come to leadership. So in many cases, you're going to inherit your team, right? So if you're a manager or a leader, you get the big promotion or you get the next chair. You didn't make any of the decisions to hire the folks that are going to work for you, right? And so you need to learn them and they need to learn you. And you need to be really open about your expectations and invite them to be open about the expectations that they would have of you. One of the big misnomers I think that a lot of young managers have is that, when they give me my manager's badge, then I have a bunch of people who work for me. And what I often tell folks is that whenever you get that tap, you actually end up working for your team much more than they'll ever work for you if you're doing it right. But I think you go into those relationships eyes wide open. I think you set out a set of expectations to your team, and I think you trust them to respond to your expectations. And through time, you build connectedness and rapport that ultimately becomes trust. Now, if somewhere along that journey those expectations don't get fulfilled, then I think when it's, you know, trust your gut, and trust that you can have an honest conversation that might not be a pleasant conversation, but it's much better to have it early and in an honest fashion than to let something go that you'll have to, you could, because you will have to later on acknowledge it and deal with it. And I think it's much better early than it is later, and much better with on the platform of trust than when distrust has been sown in because you've had to react or respond, given the fact that your expectations haven't been met. Um, I think as you develop, and in particular, when you do have the opportunity to then hire, uh, people who are going to be on your team, I think you've got to do so, with a real eye towards, trying to get underneath who is this person? Is this a person that I want to invest my trust in? And let's, to the degree you can, give me some demonstration of how you're going to become my partner. So I have teammates, I have partners. I don't have a lot of subordinates, because there's literally nothing that I do today by myself. Literally nothing. I have conversations and management exercises where we talk about the things that we want to do, the objectives that we set, the strategies, and so forth. And then I ask people to go and do those things, right? With checkbacks and expectations set, and maybe a more global view. But I don't do anything on my own, and that's the way it should be, and typically is, because it allows for those people to then also demonstrate their capabilities, their development, their creativity, and bring themselves authentically and fully to work, and hopefully trust me that what I'm in service of is our outcome, right? But also in service of making sure that they get what they need, the development that they need, that the compensation that they need, and the ability to move barriers out of their way if that's their need. That's what becomes my job. But to the core of your question, I think trust is both earned and granted, and I think that there are varying levels of trust. But I think you have to set the ground firmly up front, depending on how you come to this relationship that you're going to have with your team, and then set your expectations, and then manage toward those expectations, and trust will naturally evolve.
You, Richard, actually captured a lot of what I also believe and advocate with respect to leadership, in that it is a partnership, and that partnership is developed over a period of time. There has to be a two-way street with respect to expectations, what the leader gives to the team and what the leader expects from the team. A true partnership, it's not one person or group serving another person or group in this case. So, with that kind of mindset, with those skills, you rose up to eventually become market leader for PNC in Greater Washington, taking over after an individual that had been leading that in that role for many years. So it has its challenges of its own, but you did brilliantly in
well,
that.
well, I appreciate that. Thank you. I had the benefit of having followed Mike Harrell, who is a storied leader, certainly in his own right. But more than that, Mike really, uh, you know, I'm just going to say, did it the right way, from start to finish. We began a conversation, because I continued to live in the Greater Washington area even after I went on to run our small business division. So we began a conversation, probably a good 6 or 7 months before we made any public announcement. Mike announced his intent to retire, to some folks internally. He had had an amazing career, several markets, several layers of management, run his own bank, the whole thing. He really done it all. And when he and I began to talk about it, um, I couldn't quite see the transition. But one of the things that he assured me was, look, I know how to do this. There's a right way to do it, and there's a wrong way to do it, and I'm going to do it the right way. And I took him at his word, and he did. That first year that I was the president there in Greater Washington, Mike and I probably had, breakfast, lunch, or dinner with, I'm going to say, something like 600 people, and really good grounding in who the people of Greater Washington were, and not only the business community, but the civic community as well, and what agenda he had set for our business in the market, and a level of connection and trust to the market. You would have thought that Mike was born and raised in DC, very senatorial, for those who know Mike Harrell, very senatorial. He could have walked off of Capitol Hill, and you would have thought, well, there's the senator from the great state of wherever, heading off to do great things. And my style and approach, although different, I took a lot from the gravity that Mike was able to bring to the role, and tried to incorporate it in my own personal style. And look, we benefited from a terrific foundation. I had a great team. I am so happy that a member of that team, Jermaine Johnson, has succeeded me in the market as the now president of PNC, and is doing a great job. So the success that we had in the 4 years that followed was fabulous. But it was all, the people that we were able to assemble to lead our businesses, and the connectivity that we had to the marketplace that was Greater Washington, which today I still believe to be, if not the most dynamic regional marketplace in the country, it's top two, top three. And I'm eager to see how it and the rest of the country comes out of this time, this pandemic, time that we're in now. But just really, I had a springboard coming into the market. I was fortunate enough to take a part in the company's agendas prior to the pandemic, prior to the summer of 2020, when a lot of really sad events kind of called us to really lend our voice in a very public way to what was going on. And for me, afforded me the opportunity to help the company shape its vision for the future.
And that's something that really excites me, Richard, having had the pleasure of getting to know you, see you in action. One of the frustrations I have with a lot of organizations is that they have a lot of good statements and PR releases once something happens. And I quote one of the top consulting firms has the go-to study on the value of diversity on senior teams and return to shareholders. That consulting firm doesn't have much diversity, actually any African Americans on their own senior
Yeah,
leadership team
yeah.
globally, top 17 executives. So, number one, you were given the responsibility to become Chief Corporate Responsibility Officer for PNC, which is great knowing you and your drive. However, making that even more significant and important is that it's not just a statement. PNC was willing to commit $1 billion to help end systemic racism and support economic empowerment for African Americans, low to moderate income communities. So now you have the challenge, you have the support and the resources, Richard Bynum, to
Yeah.
tackle
Well,
this.
it's funny because when Bill Demchik, our CEO, called me, and well, I'll give you the brief story, and then get into that a little bit. So, going back to 2020 for a moment, here we sit. I remember going home in March. I think it was March 13th or something like that. And I thought, okay, well, we'll be home for a couple of weeks. We'll figure this out, and then we'll get right back to it. A couple of weeks then became, well, June, right, and so forth. And interestingly, Mahan, we had just had our first meeting of what we call the Black Leaders Forum. The Black Leaders Forum at PNC is the 150 of the most senior African American leaders in the company. And a year or two before 2020, we had a conversation with Bill about some thoughts that we had with regard to development and sponsorship of Black leaders in the company. And I and my colleague, actually my counterpart in Atlanta, a guy named Eddie Myers, who's the president down there, had been among the more highest ranked African Americans in the company. Bill, at the end of the conversation, said, well, Richard and Eddie, I need solutions to some of these things we've talked about and I agreed to. So off I go. And so for 2 years, we had sort of planned an exercise, and it culminated in the Black Leaders Forum. So we brought these 150 leaders to Washington. I hosted them in Washington, D.C. at our regional headquarters there. And we brought our executive committee at the time to come, and we spent about a day and a half really digging in and talking about some of the issues of sponsorship, development, promotion, and the real world effects of having a bench, but wanting, as any organization, it's kind of a pyramid, right? There's less seats above you than below you, so we have a lot of bench strength, but where do those folks go if they want to ascend to a higher scale and scope? And really left a very productive conversation in February of 2020. In March of 2020, we get sent home. And we're in the midst of sort of trying to figure out how you run a big bank in a global pandemic. And by the way, what about the economic impact of this pandemic on all of our customers, and then the Paycheck Protection Program, and so forth and so on. So literally, we're in the midst of this. And then George Floyd's murdered. And sort of in days around that, it's all a bit of a haze to me now, but Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, their names are added to this sort of list that I'm very aware of. But now we're at home and we're staring at a screen and 9 minutes of video, and everyone in the country galvanized around it and wondering, why won't you get off of his neck? And so that really, I think, began to change the tone of our conversation internally. We had then the civil unrest, right outside of my office, down the street is the White House, and we saw all of the things that went on around Washington, D.C. at the time, but in cities across the country and in countries across the planet, we saw an outpouring of unrest at these events. And Bill and our chief diversity officer called and sort of said, look, we want to do something. This is a time for us to speak. This is a time for us to have both internal and external conversation. Can you help us think about this? And so in all that context, we did. And we engaged in an amazingly productive set of listening sessions and learning opportunities for leaders, 52,000 employees at PNC. I think some 52,000 of them participated in this exercise. Externally, we committed $1 billion to help challenge systemic racism affecting the Black community. And the Monday following Juneteenth, which was when we made the announcement, I am thinking about vacation. I'm thinking about going on vacation because it had been a long stretch. And I didn't even know what vacation would be in a pandemic, but I thought, whatever it is, I'm going to have it. And I got a phone call from Bill, and I talked to Bill at that stage of my career. I talked to Bill maybe 2-3 times a year, usually, kind of like reporting on what's going on and what, we might need in terms of growing in the market. So I got the call and I said, and we talked for a while, and I thought, this is interesting because I'm not used to this conversation. And I'm wondering after about 20 minutes, what are we talking about? And he said, well, Richard, I I hate to do this because I know you love your job, which I did and do. But I want you to come work for me. I want you to be the first corporate responsibility officer at PNC. I want you to take on leading our effort in deploying this bid because I don't want to be a company that put a statement out and then did not fulfill. Bill is just an authentic, deep thinking leader, and he has aspirations for a company that have been realized and continue to be realized. But he also has a want to do more than say, and so I took that on, and we brought together corporate responsibility at PNC, which includes our foundation, it includes our diversity and inclusion efforts, it includes our ESG practice, and it includes, importantly, our community development banking effort, which is where the majority of our deployment of those funds happens. As of this week, we're about $260 million out the door. Some of it in DC. So you may be familiar with the Skyland project over in Ward 7, Ward 8. That is a project of literally more than 130 projects around the country that focus on either economic empowerment, education, or entrepreneurship in the Black community. So I'm pleased, but we have so much to do before we sleep in that effort. But I say all that to say that you said you've got the resources, and when I talked to Bill that afternoon about the $1 billion, I did say I think $1 billion is just a pin drop. And
It
when
is.
you talk about systemic racism, and when you talk about, again, I'm a student of history, you talk about all of the issues that I've been alive on this planet for 51 years, so I know a little of that journey. But honestly, I was a child coming out of the civil rights era, so all of the benefit that I was able to partake in as a function of what those people sacrificed, and I stand on the shoulders of those people, is amazing. But I think now actually represents one of the most important civil rights moments of our time, because we're not talking about what can we do to just even a playing field. We're talking about how can we provide a view towards an equitable outcome for all Americans, because Black history is American history. And this country is fundamentally built on the work of Black Americans, white Americans, brown Americans, and the myriad that continue to come to our shores and add to this American dream. And so I come by this humbly, but I'm very passionate about making sure that whatever small part our bank plays in that effort is meaningful and impactful. And you may know that actually since that time we've acquired a bank out in primarily the West Coast. In doing that, we actually doubled down. So we have created a broader platform for community investment, which includes $1.5 billion starting next January for 4 years in relation to that framework for the Black community, but also the deployment of dollars, $47 billion for home lending and affordable housing, which is the biggest problem this country has right now, bar none. And then beyond that, small business investment of $26.5 billion. And as a part of that, in addition to that $1.5 billion, it is part of a $14.5 billion commitment to community development banking, including opportunity zones and tax credits and all kinds of wonderful financial instruments that can help improve conditions for the people of this country. So I'm excited about being involved in deploying that, not only in Greater Washington, but across the country here next year and beyond.
And those are significant resources, Richard. And the most important part of it is that the bank is putting its resources behind the statements. So it's not just those statements. So if we are to look back at the impact that you've had in investing these resources on behalf of the bank, I highly doubt systemic racism will be wiped out over the next 4 or 5 years. It's a bigger issue than one that only PNC or a few organizations can tackle. However, inroads can be made. So if Richard and I have a conversation a few years from now, and this project has been a huge success,
Mhm.
what will have happened as a result of all these investments and all these interventions?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I often get asked the question. So, what are your goals? What are you going to put out there? And I guess what I would say is, I fundamentally believe that economic mobility is the ultimate North Star here, right? So if you think about, if I'm a simple guy. If you think about simple examples, we have an economic engine in this country that you could argue that 13% of that engine, right, is working at about 60% efficiency. Said another way, if you aggregate the Black community, you're talking about, a gap between, whether you talk about the wealth gap or you talk about the home ownership gap or you talk about the income gap or the education, whichever gap you want to focus in on. There's about a 60%, about a 2/3 to one whole relationship between that aggregated Black community and the broader universe of people in the United States. So if you try to run an engine with 13% of your pistons going at 60%, and you're running a race against the rest of the world, you're not going to win. The bottom line is you're not going to win. The world is trying to determine how it can have 100% of its pistons run at 100% efficiency. And so, I'm not sure that we have, neither the time nor the opportunity to get caught up in the issues that have created some systemic barriers for Black and brown and Asian and diverse households across this country, if we think that we are in a competition with the rest of the world, which in my view we are, right? We want to grow. We want to grow as fast or faster than whoever's number one or number two. And so I hope that the gap, again, pick your gap, wealth gap, housing gap, education gap, or what have you, that we move the needle on that gap. We're going to take a part in that. Again, our framework has to do with economic empowerment, education, and entrepreneurship. Those are three catalysts to close gaps, right? In my judgment. And inside of that, we are doing everything we can through a product lens, through a philanthropic lens, and through an access to capital lens to empower the people who believe in those catalysts to help change the outcome. So I hope that if we talk in, 5, 7 years, that we can look and we can say that gap, that baseline was here in 2021. And in 2026, we've closed it. Now, we close it 5%, we close it 10%. I think those are laudable goals, but I'm interested in the closure activity because I also happen to think that, it's just like anything else, there's a momentum to it. If we can move the needle in that direction, then it will go faster and faster once we do, because we will all enjoy the benefit of that engine working at better and better capability inside of its capacity. It's probably confusing, but that's just the way in my own simple head, that's the way I think about it. And if we can get out of the place where we think about slicing up a pie and we get into a place where we think about let's grow a bigger pie, then I think we're on the right track.
It is a great perspective because it will therefore impact all of us and the entire country's competitiveness. As you say, it will help elevate everyone by turbocharging that 60%, the 13% that has 60% running on 60% power to a higher level. So if any leader is able to achieve that, it will be you, Richard. I have no doubt about that. Now, I also know you enjoy genealogy as a hobby. What I'm wondering about that, though, is what has genealogy taught you about yourself and your own history?
Well, again, I'm a student of history, right? And it's amazing to me. So I've been able to, trace family, the benefit of privilege in computers, right? So ancestry.com, and I won't give them a plug or anything, but they have a wonderful access to vital records, to history. You can sort of trace your way back, and I can go back about 8 generations. And in many cases, you know, they call it the brick wall. The brick wall of slavery does tend to, stifle anything beyond that. But through wonderful DNA now, we can even trace further back. Not names, preciously not names, but you can get back into, the fundamental, aspects of who and what and migratory patterns and the rest of ancestors. What it's taught me is I think sometimes we oversimplify stories, and we oversimplify them, because at least my brain can only hold so much, right? So much information. We talk about, my own personal narrative around, Black history. We talk about slavery, and then we talk about Reconstruction. We then talk about Jim Crow. We talk about the Great Migration. We talk about the Civil Rights Movement, and then we talk about now. And if one thing I love to do, if you trace your history, you go back and you not only understand where your people came from, but what were the times that they were living in, and what were the circumstances of those times. And so my third great grandfather lived in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, Hillary Brown. I was able to find um, his name on the voting poll in 1891.
Oh, wow.
And so for me, I think about the fact that, today we still have conversations about voting. And then I get up, at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I head over to my poll, and I make my vote, and the process of that, and how easy, frankly, it is, but how inconvenient it is for a bunch of different reasons. In the middle of a day, in the middle of a life, in the middle of circumstance. Painfully so for the last couple of years now with the pandemic. But I then think about my third great grandfather, and how, as a person who could neither read nor write, how he got to the poll, and how he thought about voting as a fundamental right. And it was important enough for him to do it, even though he was a farmer living in rural Tennessee, as a child of slavery. And I think, you know what? Get up and go vote, right? You know, there's no excuse for me on that score. There's no excuse for not wanting everyone to exercise their right to vote, and that right is one that is the most valuable resource that we have. And so that's just one sort of lesson that I get from genealogy. But the thought of taking the people, whose names maybe you don't know, who you never really met, but are related to you in some distant fashion, and placing them in history, is a powerful reminder of how good we have it today, how privileged we are, and what our responsibilities are inside of that goodness and that privilege and those shoulders that we all stand on.
And what those shoulders and those people like your grandfather have done in order for us to have some of the luxuries and freedoms that we enjoy today, putting it then on our shoulders to do more, so a couple of generations
Yeah.
from now, our grandchildren and great grandchildren can look back at this moment and see that we also contributed to a change at this
and
moment.
and not and
So,
not take it for granted. Not take it for
absolutely,
granted. Yeah.
absolutely. So I would love to know if there are any leadership resources, Richard, that you find yourself typically recommending or have been go-to resources for you as you have developed your own leadership style.
Um, we live in a wonderful age of information. Um, I don't know the statistic, but there was this an anecdote a few years ago. I heard that the amount of pictures and videos doubles on the planet, doubles every day, or some crazy thing like that. And this resource of the internet, that we use for such woeful things like social media, also benefits us, immediate and total access. I'm amazed at my kids. I have a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old, teenagers, and invariably I'll be in a conversation with my son, and I'll say, "Oh, what about this and what about that?" And he'll go, "Hold on, let me look that up." And it's all in his hand. The entire sum total of American human knowledge in his hands. So I use that. TED Talks are amazing. Podcasts like this are amazing. Um, I trade in information with colleagues and friends, from sources like, Northwestern. I will give Northwestern the first plug, but Harvard, and Wharton, and Brown, and these wonderful institutions of higher learning that we have. There are a number of people out there that I, will read or will listen to, and their books and so forth. There are a number of people out there who I will not read and I will not listen to. So I do think you have to be discerning in your judgment, a bit. And I think you also have to, I'm a believer, in institution. I'm a believer in, the fact that having a learned understanding of things, requires a level of respect. And just because I have an opinion doesn't mean that I actually have a grasp of, the concept. I should read more. I should learn more. I should listen more. And so I do that. I don't really often, wax too poetic, although I guess this last hour I've waxed a lot of poetry. But I do avail myself of all the marvelous benefits that the internet provides.
Well, Richard Bynum, these Tuesday conversations are conversations with change makers, and you have been a brilliant star of a change maker, both in the greater Washington, D.C. region, now on a national level. So it has been an absolute pleasure and honor having a chance to find out a little bit more about your journey and the passion and commitment you have to making a difference to make it a better world for all of us. Thank you so much for joining me in this conversation, Richard
Well, Mahan,
Bynum.
that's kind of you to say. Thank you for that. And it's been a pleasure speaking with you today as well.